So that's the end of movie time. And we're going to go back through the three hypotheses, but I just wanted to give you guys a chance to kind of refresh. I know these stories are well known and there are lots of details in them, so I just wanted to give you guys a chance to feel the stories on their own. So before I go through the three hypotheses, I need to distinguish the way that I'm looking at the religious myths and the way that I'm looking at the historical philosophy. Mainly, I'm taking a symbolic interpretation of the myths and then trying to support that with religious interpretations. So, for example, I'm looking at symbolic expressions of transcending matter, and then I will look at the religious versions within the same traditions. So, say I'm looking at classical symbols of transcending matter, then I might reinforce that with an Orphic religious tradition from the classical world that has the same religious attitude. So that's the way I'm looking at the myths and religions, is really symbolically. And then the historical narratives are way more straightforward. We're looking at those historically, or that particular narrative historically. This is probably the most important slide to land, and this slide is about the first hypothesis and the entry into materialism. So let's look at it mythologically and then philosophically. Mythologically, there are lots and lots of demonstrations and examples that support this thesis, but I want to focus now, since we have limited time, on the three biggest and most central. And so first is just straightforward, the creation of humans from clay, from matter. This is in the story of Prometheus. This is the story of Adam and Eve, and it can be found all over the world. There's silly little stories like in China, the different colors of clay result in different classes. Clay, humans made from clay, is pretty consistent all over the world, or can be consistently found all over the place. And it's consistent also with the contemporary stories of a robot attaining consciousness, right? It's this idea of inner matter that's animated by consciousness. So you have it in the old Golem story, or the Frankenstein, or Pinocchio, and I know Maria likes Spielberg's AI. Same idea, going back to Adam and Eve, Deucalion, Pandora. These are humans made from clay, animated by consciousness. So as soon as consciousness, which presumably exists, it's kind of implicit in these stories that consciousness exists in a way before it falls into the body, or maybe it's God's consciousness before it enters the body. And the idea is that once consciousness is in a body, it now has to live in an embodied world, which means eating and defecating, birth, death, sex, the limitation by the sensory, by the flesh senses, and the isolation to the physical body, which implies various degrees of estrangement, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And also what you find in these stories, the Adam and Eve story and the Prometheus and Pandora stories, that emphasize all of these different pieces. You also find an emphasis on new technologies. If it's in Adam and Eve, though there may be no mention of a technology, the images show them quickly using pickaxes to work the land. So, or adzes. I love the ads for Egyptian reasons. But anyway, then lastly, so not only is there a creation of humans from clay, a fall of consciousness into the material body, but also into the material world, and it becomes, I think, the climax of the symbol of this entry into material limitation is in the actual restraint of the two progenitors to stone. So Prometheus is chained to a stone mountain, and Adam is buried in a cave, stone cave. And actually, if we look at some real nice details and different variants of the Prometheus story, you find he in some versions is also buried in a cave, especially in the Georgian version of Amirani. So these are the three primary reasons why I interpret these myths as an expression of an entry into a materialistic mode of being and materialistic reality, and the recognition of those realities as limiting. And you also find that Prometheus is in despair for his isolation, and that Adam and Eve, beat on their chest and wail. So the estrangement, the emotional and existential estrangement, is very present in these stories too. So then philosophically, scientifically, it's very straightforward. As mentioned in the story, according to the way Aristotle has told the story and the way we like to tell it since, Thales was the first philosopher, and his first premise was that everything reduces to substance. There's a nice little twist about that. He actually says everything reduces to water, which I might interpret as waves, but that's not how the story is told. The story is told that it began with materialism. And it might be said, and Kieran made a great point in my dissertation, that when you just look at Thales, it's hard to say that he's really giving birth to materialism proper, that that's his main point. You might say that his main point is monism, to look for one singular explanation of all things. But Aristotle, his telling of the story and the continued telling, is to really emphasize materialism. So then it's actually in this same place, in Miletus, in this Eden of philosophy, where the atom itself is conceptualized according to the story. Maybe it was Persians first, God knows. But the story, as it's told, is that Leucippus came up with atomism in Miletus. Democritus visited him there and brought it to Athens. And when he brought it to Athens, that's where it got picked up by Aristotle, a fellow Thracian. And it was, as much as it was hated by Plato, it came to change the world and really spread. So classical atomism came to hugely influence the Western European world, and Newton, probably the most important atomist since Democritus. Newton, and this is really profound. This is something I focused on in my undergraduate thesis. Actually, was that up until Newton, you may have had this vague idea that everything is explainable by a logos, everything is patterned, everything can be scientifically or physically understood. But until Newton's calculus and his laws of physics and laws of momentum, that you couldn't actually show it. Newton, once and for all, gave us a paradigm that was like, holy cow, that's really how the world works physically, mechanically. And it was so obvious that not only intellectuals picked up on it, but it empowered an entire common sense movement that enabled Europeans and Westerners to challenge religion with the strength of their conviction for the scientific paradigm, to challenge states. So during this time and ever since, you've seen the emergence of atomistic theories beyond atomism, the projection of atomism into everything, you know. And in our own field, you see it in Levi-Strauss mythemes, but you got phonemes and memes and Hobbes. I hate the cover of the Leviathan, Hobbes' Leviathan, because it's a bunch of people that make up one big king, and so you have an atomized vision of humanity, and of course this hierarchical image. Anyway, so let's move on to the second hypothesis,